present research and evidence to improve palliative medicine.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. It really is an honor to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for their kind invitation. And I think it is a powerful advocacy group such as this that is going to move the field further forward and going to provide the excellent care that all our patients need, and hopefully to encourage also more support for research in palliative care. And this afternoon, that is my focus, to talk about the structure and process for palliative care research, to look at some of the opportunities as well as the challenges that particularly we experience in the United States. I'm going to refer also to our Canadian colleagues, and my apologies for being somewhat US-centric. It's just because this is the place I know. This is a place I work in. Of course, there are issues with regard to palliative care research, primarily funding. There are also issues with regard to research outcomes, although I see this as an advantage for palliative care because of the newfound interest in improving quality of health care in the United States. Many of those objectives align with what we've been doing in palliative care for many decades. I think also I'm going to touch on the scope of research. Unfortunately, we're moving beyond just patients with cancer, the elderly. We are now moving into other disease states, also other ages. There's been an explosion in research with regard to pediatric palliative care. And then I'm going to stress the issue of cooperation, which has been a consistent theme throughout the morning and starting this afternoon. And of course, data availability and collection. Without information being gathered, without researchers being able to analyze this information, how are we going to advance research? And throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to some landmark studies. There have been several landmark studies in North America affirming the role of palliative care, how important it is. And I'm going to use these landmark studies to illustrate some of the challenges with regard to process and also structure. Now, most of these studies have been observational research studies, although they're increasing number of randomized controlled trials. Nevertheless, both observational studies and randomized controlled trials have been practice-changing in that they've produced evidence, which has resulted in clinical practice change. So starting with the funding regarding palliative care research. So in essence, it really is dismal in the United States as far as the federal government is concerned. I've got to stress that less than 1% of the National Institute of Health funding is allocated to palliative care. Now, if you look at the sources, where does this funding come from? Predominantly, it is again from the conventional groups. So the NCI, National Cancer Institute, focuses particularly on patients with cancer. The NIA, National Institute of Aging, on the elderly, and then NINR is the National Institute of Nursing Research. So those three groups are the primary funders of palliative care research, but again, stressing less than 1%. If you look at the other groups on the right, which are devoted to research into lung diseases, heart diseases, and also kidney diseases, the funding is just about zero. And it's not as though these patients with these disease states don't have the palliative care issues. Of course they do. They have the same symptom burden, and they also have the psychosocial distress, the spiritual distress, and they obviously also need palliative care. Now, despite this lack of funding, there has been consistent improvement in publication of research articles regarding palliative care. So if you look at the graph on your left, there's been an increase in the number of palliative care investigators that have published, and these investigators typically have more funding from the NIH than they had before. And also, if you look on the far right, the number of manuscripts published in non-palliative care journals has also increased. And I think this is interesting because this suggests that there's increased uptake by other disciplines of palliative care. And they're often published in high-impact journals also. So while the federal government has not been the perfect, I think, supporter of palliative care, shall we say, other organizations have filled the gap in some respect. The American Cancer Society, philanthropic funding has been very important for the National Palliative Care Research Center, and the NPCRC has been particularly important in funding pilot grants for early and mid-career researchers. And this is vital in your early career. And I myself was a fortunate recipient of an American Cancer Society grant. I think another important aspect of developing a career as a junior researcher is mentoring. And I think we can't underestimate the importance here of individual health care institutions have provided support in the form of salary as well as internal grants for researchers in palliative care. And I was, again, in my junior career, the recipient of some wonderful mentoring at MD Anderson. So another issue with regards to palliative care research is what should be measured. right? And so this is an excellent article, and I think is probably true that we haven't really advanced up until a few decades ago as regards measuring important outcomes. And we need to really measure something more important than whether a patient is alive or deceased in an institution. And so here, I think palliative care, again, is well positioned with a newfound interest in improving health care in the United States, that we've always really looked at outcomes that are patient-centered, patient-focused, and every day, really, we elicit patient-reported outcomes. So just to go back, and this is somewhat of a repeat of Professor Larkin's slide a little earlier, but it's important to know what is important to patients, right? So if you look at the ranking from 1 to 9, what patients consider the most important attributes, this was a study looking at 1,500 individuals, looking at patients, bereaved family members, physicians, and other care providers, and you can see the one they ranked the most was freedom from pain, secondly, peace with God, presence of family, being mentally aware, and that their treatment choices were followed. So this was a United States study. And the font is really very small here, but this is a Canadian study, again, somewhat similar, but this focused on patients alone and also asked them to rank what was most important to them at the end of life. And number 1 is to trust and have confidence in the doctors looking after you, not to be kept on life support when there's little hope for a meaningful recovery. Thirdly, that information about your disease be communicated to you by your doctor in an honest manner, so they want a candid conversation with their physicians. And the rest of the rankings really touch on the things that we've spoken about before. Important to have symptom management, important to have to be able to discuss with doctors your fears about dying. These are all highly ranked by patients. Of course, despite the fact that this is highly ranked by patients, these PROs, or patient-reported outcomes, have not been supported in general by traditional funding mechanisms. So there has been progress in this as well, and a non-governmental organization, PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, relies on a lot of patient perspective to guide research. You cannot submit a grant without getting a patient advocacy group or a patient's perspective. You absolutely need that before you can submit the grant. And I think what's even more encouraging, that recently they allocated $25 million for symptom research in patients with advanced illness. So this has been a terrific improvement. However, I think that PROs should be routinely incorporated in many other clinical trials, especially clinical trials with regard to treatment interventions for cancer. It's good and well to look at the effect of the chemotherapy on a tumor, but what about the patient experience who's undergoing this therapy? And I think there is a move to include more PROs in trials, but unfortunately many of the times this information is discarded and not analyzed. And then a theme of collaboration, which I think was mentioned a little earlier and certainly this morning. I think it's important that we start thinking about cooperative groups and multi-center trials, because it's important that these important studies, these landmark trials, need to be generalizable. Once they're repeated, they're reproduced in other centers, we can adopt them into guidelines and clinical practice. And so for palliative care, there's also another issue. There's a potential, of course, for disease progression in our patients, unfortunately, and an inability for them to continue trial participation. And again, if we create cooperative groups, multi-center trials, then we can accrue more patients and complete research. And there's been some progress in this with the Palliative Care Research Cooperative, which is palliative care focused, and the National Clinical Trials Network, which really focuses on symptom management in patients with cancer. And then just to look at one of these landmark trials, which I'm suggesting should be reproduced in a multi-center study, and in fact, they recently completed the multi-center study and we're eagerly waiting for the results. But this important trial showed that combining early palliative care with standard oncology care was better than standard care alone. However, it was at a single center, less than 200 patients. But what they showed was important, that at 12 weeks, there was improved quality of life, less depression, improved length of life. And I agree with some of the speakers earlier that we should not be focused on increasing the length of life. But it did make a big splash in the media that palliative care actually resulted in lengthening of survival. At the same time, I would challenge you to find a single study in palliative care that shows shortened survival. Right? Palliative care has never shortened survival. So it shouldn't come as such a surprise to people. And then again, as far as this collaboration was concerned, I think today's Congress is a perfect example of collaboration. People from multiple disciplines, multiple cultures, multiple religions. However, I think in palliative care, we have another opportunity, maybe an opportunity that we've missed. We know that several of our symptoms still are inadequately treated, that we don't have good interventions for them, namely fatigue, cachexia, neuropathic pain. And I think there's an opportunity here of advancing the field, moving towards better control of these symptoms if we collaborate, palliative care researchers collaborate with basic scientists. An example is cachexia, which is a devastating condition. Patients have involuntary weight loss, they feel weaker. And there is a professional organization that is focused entirely on this syndrome and brings together clinicians, brings together basic scientists for yearly symposiums, publishes a highly regarded scientific journal, and I think this provides an excellent forum for this exchange of ideas between clinical and preclinical scientists. And also we've recently established a translational center for investigating neuropathic pain in patients with cancer. So I think it's also up to individual centers to further this field. And then one of the last things I want to touch on is palliative care in every setting for every person. And some of the challenges here are collection of patient-reported outcomes, which are often not routine, and also the access to administrative data, which is not universal. Also, I want to touch on the breadth and integration of palliative care services, how this varies, and how it proves to be an impediment to further research. So as regards the daily collection of patient-reported outcomes, I think we can look to our Canadian colleagues as a shining example of how it should be done. So as you can see here are over 10,000 patients with cancer where their symptoms were assessed and recorded and collected. And this was not part of a formal study. This is a part of daily clinical practice. So in Ontario, Canada, the entire province has a program where patients who see oncologists are asked about their symptoms, and this is collected either by an electronic tablet or by electronic kiosk. So I think this is feasible, it can be done, and allows the clinicians to focus on the symptoms that are causing the most problems for the patients. It also has resulted in some other unexpected outcomes, such as decreased health utilization, decreased visits to the emergency room once these ESAS symptoms were collected. Another issue is the availability of data. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have availability of CMS data, Medicare data of patients over the age of 65, but getting data for patients under 65, as far as administrative data, is not so easy and is fairly expensive. And this study really illustrates how important administrative data can be, because contrary to our expectations, that palliative care and hospice care was decreasing unnecessary aggressive care. This study shows something different. I'll refer you to the top line, where deaths in acute care hospitals did decrease from 2000 to 2009, from 32.6% to around 24%. At the same time, also hospice use increased from 21% to 42%. So you would expect then that aggressive care would decrease. But to the contrary, the opposite happened, right? ICU use in the last month of life increased, and also these healthcare transitions in the last 3 days of life also increased. So patients moved from one institution to the other or were readmitted in the last 3 days of life. So this suggests that patients are receiving more aggressive care, perhaps more inappropriate aggressive care, and just spending a few days in hospice. I'll also refer to the integration and availability of palliative care. I won't even touch on the access, which might be a completely different issue. But in the United States, this was a survey of palliative care centers at premier cancer centers. So NCI cancer centers are regarded as the best. They're the cancer centers that have shown expertise in prevention of cancer, identification, and management of cancer. And you can see the NCI cancer centers in green have really suboptimal palliative care. I'll refer you particularly to dedicated palliative care beds. So about less than 30% of NCI cancer centers in the United States have a palliative care unit. And, you know, intuitively, we think palliative care units are the gold standard of palliative care. Here you manage patients with the most severe physical, psychosocial distress, You have family meetings, which are incredibly important interventions, and you have an interdisciplinary team. You have a chaplain, social worker, you also have skilled nurses, and you also have a consistent message regarding goals of care. But how to prove this benefit? We think palliative care units are great, but when very few health systems, even NCI cancer centers, have palliative care units, how are we going to show that? Well, fortunately, there is some systematic approach to implementing palliative care across hospitals in the United States. And the example I have is with the Veterans Administration hospitals. And this was really, I think, a landmark study from the Veterans Administration where they looked at 77 hospitals with palliative care, and they compared the experience of caregivers, so family members who received palliative care versus those who didn't receive palliative care. That's the column on the left. And you can see there was a significant improvement in the experience of family members who received palliative care. They felt that the overall care was significantly better. Providers took time to listen. Providers were kind, caring, respectful. Providers kept family members informed. And then when they compared palliative care consultation to the palliative care unit was even better, right? But we need a system-wide implementation of a clinical program to show that. And then the last few things I want to touch on is the scope of research. I mentioned that research has moved away from being exclusively focused on oncology, exclusively focused on the elderly, and a recent systematic review of 124 randomized controlled trials showed that palliative care does improve selected outcomes in other disease states. COPD, dementia is two examples. And I think it is important to take the next steps for these other organizations involved in other disease states. And I know we want to avoid compartmentalizing patients in disease states, but I think we need to take our colleagues to task. So it's all well in incorporating palliative care into the guidelines of professional organizations such as American Heart Association, American College of Surgeons. But to borrow Eduardo Bruera's terminology, this means they've just overcome their palliphobia. The difficulty is, are they just being sources of palliolalia, right? Are they saying palliative care is important? But really they need to show active support. I think the next steps would be support of palliative research by the individual societies, cardiology societies, pulmonary societies, as has been done by the American Cancer Society with oncology. And then I think Professor Larkin also referred to the research and clinical workforce shortage in Europe, and certainly we have the same issue in the United States, where between 6,000 to 18,000 additional clinical physicians are needed. I think researchers are also clearly going to be needed, and once again, there are terrific disparities in rural areas, and we also have a rapidly growing racially and ethnic diverse population of older adults who are going to need to be treated. So, in summary then, national and regional strategy, I think, for research is needed. We heard earlier that the WHO suggests that every nation has a national strategy. I think in the United States we have this unfortunate patchwork of care, and there certainly isn't even a national strategy for implementing clinical palliative care. I think funding gaps remain. I think, though, there is an opportunity because palliative care research is really aligned with the future healthcare needs. There's a realization in the United States that quality is suboptimal. And some of the outcomes that they're looking at with improving healthcare have been traditionally the purview of palliative care. I think we need to improve data availability and routine PRO collection. And I think there is some interest in other disciplines in increasing the scope of research expansion, providing a better evidence base, but they really need to fund this. And interdisciplinary cooperation, I think, is also vital in order to produce new research. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.